Now, a lot of people don't understand, one of the backgrounds for the Russian revolutions, besides the Brusilov offensive, which I'll talk about, is that when Turkey came in the war, the Dardanelles and Straits cut off Russian trade from the Black Sea. 80% of their trade was through the Black Sea. So when I get to a tie in the fact, Brusilov offensive, well over 1 million casualties, and the fact that people were starving and weapons weren't getting there because of the Dardanelles. But these are things you have to tie together, the books don't always point out. Everybody recognized the war would be decided in the West because of the industrialized countries. And the fact is, the country that could produce the most war material, including airplanes, is going to win. And again, I want to emphasize, Germany could not get raw materials should we use ersatz materials. I'm going to talk about Russia first, and I have some slides, but we don't start them yet. Russia possessed one of the largest aviation fleets in the world when the war began. But the Russian problem, like that of Austria-Hungary, was the Russians lacked a sophisticated and technologically advanced economic base, which crippled their air services from the beginning. The planes they built were of very low quality and usually obsolete by the time they got to the front. There were only 4 Tsarist factories that were capable of producing airplanes when the war began, and only 2 that could produce airplane chassis. Therefore, a serious problem is the Russians didn't have engines and spare parts. They had to count on the West, which were not rapid in helping them. But that factor is what proved fatal for the Russian air power. The Russians became heavily reliant on the French support to maintain their air power. But again, the blockade did not help. The only way to get material to Russia was the icebound ports of Vladivostok in Asia, and then around Murmansk, which were, as you know, icebound for 6 months of the year. On the other hand, the Russian economy could not support the war industry. One of the greatest myths of the First World War is about the Russian steamroller. And that's one reason I tell my students, don't read Barbara Tuchman. Everybody thinks it's a classic. It's way outdated, totally out of picture with the Eastern Front and all the other stuff. But that's another story. The key is that the industry could not support the war industry or help with air power. By the end of 1914, Russian air power had dropped by almost 50%. And the problem was they were having trouble getting replacement aircraft. The implication should be clear. An unsophisticated and technologically deficient economy, such as in Russia and Austria-Hungary, could not adequately sustain a major war power effort. As I said, most of the Russian planes were obsolete in 1914. By the end of the first month of the war, the number had gone from 244 to 141. And then the other problem comes in is the lack of logistical support. And yet the Russians had the most advanced bomber. The Ilya, I always mispronounce it because I used to do it in Russian, I can't do it in English. Yes, thank you. Was the world's first heavy bomber. It had massive range, size, and bomb capacity. When armed with 6 machine guns, it was almost impossible to shoot down. These planes flew 400 plus bombing missions on the Eastern Front, and of 73 bombers, only 1 would be shot down. In importing airplanes, the Russians had problems. I mentioned engines, etc., and the problem was getting stuff from the Western powers. The French and British always gave them the older models. This is true of the Austro-Hungarians. The German government on January 1st, 1915, gave the Austro-Hungarians 70 airplanes because most of the units, when it came time for them to fly, the airplanes couldn't take off. So the Germans gave them better airplanes and gave them 10 airplanes a month to keep them in the air. Now, I want to mention something. Somebody asked about Curtiss. The Russian government bought 56 U.S. Curtiss company planes. They were in such deplorable condition, not one could take off. So the Russians began to wonder about American technology. Now let's talk about Austria-Hungary. A lot of people know nothing about Austria-Hungary. My students think it's near Newark, New Jersey. Anyway, Austria-Hungary also lacked industrial and technological sophistication. Thus, they were unable to meet anywhere near the demands to create a first-class air force. In fact, I mentioned that the planes were carried by oxen and horses. That's how the submarines were taken to the ports at the Adriatic. Again, this shows you how far back they are. But the Austrians also, Austro-Hungarians also, as the Russians, became dependent upon foreign airplanes. In fact, Austria-Hungary produced 1/10 of the amount of airplanes that Germany produced in the war, and realized that Germans were outproduced themselves. So in other words, Austria-Hungary became dependent upon Germany for its airplanes as well as submarines. I'll skip Germany because a lot of us know about that. I'm going to go to battles now. The Battle of Tannenberg. You read about it in the textbooks, and you could talk about it for hours. It is the greatest defensive battle of the year. It's the opening battle in East Prussia. East Prussia was defended by the Prussian 8th Army. The German commanders allowed the Russian Cossacks to come in. The 35 cav divisions, about 15 were involved, knowing that they would rape, rob, murder. And that's why I have not found any book that shows any Cossack prisoner of war taken on the German front the rest of the war. But the Battle of Tannenberg, we hear, and it's true, the Russians in 1894 had promised to launch an offensive on the 17th mobilization day with 800,000 troops. Impossible. Infrastructure alone wouldn't allow that. But the Russians invade. The two armies are divided by the Masurian Lakes. They start the invasion without all their units, without their reserves, without their ammunition, without their supply system set up, but most importantly, without their code books. And this is the key to the victory. That's what our textbooks tell us. No. German airplanes followed every movement of the Russian 1st and 2nd Army. And that and the code is what enables them to win this victory at Tannenberg. Now, the Germans are using embryonic state of photography and wireless telegraphy, and this is critical. Now, I'm not going to go into it, but in the campaigns in October, November, December, and right through the war, the German airplanes provide the information that is going to be vital in their victories, and we'll see when I get to 1915 how important that is. These are Russian soldiers. Something about the Russians, they would attack in 8 columns. The first column of 8 lines would have rifles. The second column might have 25% rifles. The rest of the columns could be 10 or 12, no rifles. They've never been trained with rifles. They pick up the rifles of the dead on the battlefield. I just skipped past that one. Here's a picture of winter air. I can't tell you what the airplane models are because my forte is actually field battles, and Steve here got me interested in this stuff, and I'm fascinated now. So the book I'm writing now for Cambridge, I'm having to adjust because of all these good things I'm learning. That's Steve Sotheby dropping a bomb on a class. The other thing, that's the other thing I want to mention. You talk about bombing. For a good part of the war, the size of the bomb was that of a typewriter. So they had more effect sometimes dropping these iron bars straight down. And you had a bad day that hit you in the head. Okay, the battles of Galicia. I'm not going to go in a lot of detail, but you can read one of my books. They're very inexpensive, and then I can buy pizza on Friday nights. In Galicia,